This is the story of a humble engine that changed American culture forever. The Ford Flathead V8. An engine so simple, so affordable, and so brilliantly designed that it humiliated the expensive 12-cylinder powerhouses of its era and accidentally created an entire subculture that would define cool for generations. We're talking hot rods, drag racing, and the American obsession with speed itself. Along the way, we'll encounter desperate engineers, the Great Depression, bootleggers, teenage rebels, and a fundamental truth about engineering that nobody expected. So, let us begin. But first, what exactly was the automotive world like before this revolutionary little engine appeared? To understand why the Flathead V8 mattered so much, you need to understand what cars were like in the early 1930s. And honestly, they were a mess. If you wanted power, real power, you needed a big engine. And big engines meant big money. Cadillac, Packard, Lincoln, these companies were building magnificent 12-cylinder and even 16-cylinder engines. They were engineering marvels. They were also absurdly expensive. I mention this because the average American in 1932 could not afford these machines. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Banks were failing. Unemployment was climbing past 20%. People were standing in bread lines. The idea of buying a luxury automobile with a V12 engine was about as realistic as buying a private yacht. So what did regular people drive? 4-cylinder engines mostly. Maybe a straight 6 if you had some money. These were dependable, cheap, and boring. They got you from one place to another. That was about it. There was no excitement, no thrill, no sense that your car was anything other than basic transportation. And this is where Henry Ford enters our story. Now, Ford was already a legend by this point. His Model T had put America on wheels. He had pioneered the assembly line and changed manufacturing forever. But by the early 30s, Ford was struggling. General Motors was eating into his market share. The Model A was fine, but fine was not going to win the sales war. Ford needed something revolutionary. Here's what Ford wanted. He wanted a V8 engine that regular working Americans could actually afford. Not a luxury item, not a status symbol, a V8 for the masses. And if you know anything about engines, you know this sounds almost impossible. See, V8 engines existed. They had been around since the early 1900s, but they were expensive to manufacture because they required 2 separate cylinder blocks that had to be bolted together. This was complex, time-consuming, and costly. Every manufacturer who had tried to build a cheap V8 had failed. Ford's engineers told him it could not be done. They told him the metallurgy was too difficult, the casting process too unreliable, the whole concept too ambitious. Ford reportedly listened to all of these objections and then told his engineers to do it anyway. This is pure Henry Ford. The man was brilliant, but also incredibly stubborn. He once kept producing the Model T for years after it had become obsolete, simply because he refused to admit he needed to change. But this time, his stubbornness would pay off in ways nobody anticipated. The engineering challenge was this. Could you cast an entire V8 engine block as a single piece of metal? If you could, you would eliminate most of the manufacturing complexity and cost. But nobody had ever done it successfully at scale. The metal had to cool evenly throughout the casting. Any irregularity, and you got cracks, warping, engines that would fail catastrophically. Ford threw resources at the problem. He hired metallurgists. He experimented with different alloys, he built new foundry equipment, and after an insane amount of trial and error, after countless failures and false starts, they figured it out. They managed to cast a V8 engine block in a single piece. On March 31, 1932, Ford unveiled the Flathead V8 to the world. It produced 65 horsepower. Now, that might not sound impressive by modern standards, but consider this. The 4-cylinder engine it replaced produced 40 horsepower. This was a 60% increase in power. And here's the truly remarkable part. The V8 version of the car cost only $50 more than the four-cylinder model. Think about what that meant. Suddenly, a factory worker, a farmer, a small business owner could walk into a Ford dealership and drive away with a V8 engine. Real power, real speed, for basically the same money as the boring option. The competition was blindsided. Cadillac's V8 engines cost thousands of dollars. Ford's cost a fraction of that. And while the Flathead was not as refined as those luxury engines, it did not need to be. It was good enough, and it was cheap enough. Sometimes good enough and cheap enough beats perfect and expensive. If you're enjoying this story about how simple engineering changed American culture, consider subscribing. It really helps us reach more people who love this kind of history. But anyway, back to the Flathead. The name Flathead came from the engine's design. Traditional engines had valves in the cylinder head. The Flathead put its valves in the block itself, beside the cylinders. This made the cylinder head flat, hence the name. It was a simpler, older design philosophy. Some engineers considered it backwards. But here's the thing about simpler designs. They're easier to work on, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Because Ford had accidentally created something he never intended. He had created an engine that regular people could modify. See, the Flathead V8 was mechanically straightforward. You could look at it and understand how it worked. The parts were accessible. If you wanted to make it faster, you could actually do that in your garage with basic tools. Try doing that with a modern engine, and you'll probably set your car on fire. The first people to really exploit this were not teenage hot rodders. They were bootleggers. During Prohibition and its immediate aftermath, men who ran illegal liquor needed fast cars. They needed to outrun the police. And suddenly, here was an affordable engine that could be hopped up for more power. Bootleggers would bore out the cylinders, install multiple carburetors, modify the exhaust. They turned ordinary Ford sedans into screaming getaway machines. The cops, often driving the same stock Fords, could not catch them. I mention this because these bootleggers were accidentally developing the techniques that would later define hot rod culture. Now this is where it gets fascinating. After Prohibition ended, a lot of these modified cars and the knowledge of how to build them ended up in California, specifically in the dry lake beds of the Mojave Desert. Young men started gathering at places like El Mirage and Muroc to race their modified cars across the flat, hard-packed dirt. They called it dry lakes racing. These were not wealthy young men with factory racing teams. These were working-class kids with more ambition than money. And what did they use? Flathead V8s. Because Flatheads were everywhere, they were cheap, and they responded beautifully to modification. The culture that emerged around this was unlike anything America had seen. These young men became obsessed with speed, with extracting every possible horsepower from their engines. They shared techniques. They experimented endlessly. They built machines that looked like nothing on the road and went faster than anything had a right to go. They stripped the bodies down to reduce weight. They channeled them, which means lowering the body over the frame. They chopped the roofs to reduce wind resistance. They added multiple carburetors, custom headers, high-compression cylinder heads. The Flathead V8, designed as a cheap engine for everyday drivers, became the heart of a performance revolution. And here's something that always strikes me about this period. The hot rod movement was fundamentally democratic. You did not need to be rich, you needed to be clever and willing to work. A teenager with a part-time job could buy a used Ford with a Flathead, spend his weekends in the garage, and build something genuinely fast. That accessibility changed everything. World War II interrupted the movement, but also accelerated it in strange ways. Young men who had been building hot rods suddenly found themselves maintaining aircraft engines and military vehicles. They learned precision machining. They learned about aerodynamics. They learned about exotic fuels and supercharging. When they came home, they applied all of that knowledge to their cars. The post-war hot rod scene exploded. Magazines like Hot Rod, founded in 1948, spread the gospel of the Flathead V8 across the country. What had been a regional California phenomenon became a national obsession. Kids in Ohio and Texas and Florida were suddenly ordering speed parts and tearing apart their Fords. But let's talk about what made the Flathead specifically so good for this. Yes, it was cheap. Yes, it was simple. But there was something else. The engine had an enormous amount of developmental potential. When Ford released the engine in '32, it made 65 horsepower. That was with a conservative tune, designed for reliability and fuel economy. But the basic architecture could handle much more. Hot rodders discovered they could safely double that power output with relatively simple modifications. The aftermarket industry that grew up around the Flathead was extraordinary. Companies like Edelbrock, Offenhauser, and Wyand started manufacturing high-performance parts specifically for the Flathead. Intake manifolds that could accept multiple carburetors, cylinder heads with better port flow, high-performance camshafts, racing ignition systems. Vic Edelbrock Sr. started in his Los Angeles shop developing manifolds for flatheads. His son would turn that business into one of the largest speed equipment manufacturers in the world. The entire performance aftermarket industry can trace its roots back to the Flathead V8 and the kids who wanted to make it faster. Think about that for a moment. A cheap engine from the Depression era spawned an industry worth billions of dollars today. The competition aspect cannot be overstated. Hot rodders did not just build fast cars to cruise around, they raced them. First at the dry lakes, then on abandoned airstrips, then at purpose-built drag strips. The National Hot Rod Association, founded in 1951, created organized drag racing specifically to get these kids off the streets and onto safe, sanctioned courses. And what powered the vast majority of early drag racers? Flathead V8s. Well into the 1950s, modified flatheads were competitive against much newer engines. The accumulated knowledge of how to make them fast was simply too valuable. There's a beautiful irony here. Ford had built the Flathead to be cheap and reliable transportation. The company never really supported the racing community. Henry Ford himself supposedly disapproved of racing, but it was precisely because the engine was cheap and reliable that it became the foundation of American motorsport. Now I should mention the Flathead's limitations because they were real. That side valve design that made it simple also limited its breathing at high RPM. The exhaust ports ran through the block, which caused heat management problems. At extreme power levels, the Flathead could run hot and damage itself. Engineers were aware of these issues from the beginning. But for the intended purpose, cheap, reliable transportation, none of it mattered. And for hot rodders, these problems were just challenges to overcome. Better cooling systems, better oil coolers, modified heads that improved exhaust flow. Every limitation became an opportunity for innovation. The Flathead stayed in production in American Fords until 1953, 21 years. In that time, Ford manufactured millions of these engines. They powered cars, trucks, tractors, boats, aircraft ground equipment, and industrial applications. The basic design proved adaptable to almost anything. But by the early 50s, the engine was showing its age. Overhead valve designs, like the ones Chevrolet and Oldsmobile were introducing, simply made more power more efficiently. The small block Chevrolet V8, introduced in '55, would eventually dethrone the Flathead as the hot rodder's engine of choice. And yet, the Flathead never really went away. It remained the engine of traditional hot rodding. Purists argued that a real hot rod needed a Flathead. The distinctive look of those finned Edelbrock heads, the rumble of that side valve exhaust, became iconic. What of the people who shaped this story? What of Vic Edelbrock Sr.? He died in 1962 just as the performance industry he helped create was entering its golden age. His company lived on and thrived, eventually becoming one of the premier names in automotive performance. And what of Henry Ford? The man who demanded his engineers do the impossible lived long enough to see the Flathead's complete production run. He passed away in 1947 at 83 years old, having utterly transformed not just the automotive industry, but American society itself. The Flathead was just one of his many innovations, but it might be the one with the most unexpected cultural impact. The broader meaning of the Flathead V8 story is something that applies far beyond automotive engineering. Sometimes the winning approach is not the most sophisticated one, it is the most accessible one. Consider what the expensive approach looked like. Cadillac and Packard built magnificent engines with 12 and 16 cylinders. They were engineering triumphs. They were also completely irrelevant to most Americans. Only the wealthy could afford them. They had no democratizing effect at all. The Flathead was different. By making the V8 affordable, Ford gave power to the people, literally. And those people did things with that power that Ford never imagined. There is a lesson here about technology and democracy. The most important technologies are often not the most advanced ones. They are the ones that reach the most people. The iPhone changed the world not because it was the most sophisticated smartphone, but because it was the first truly accessible one. The Internet became revolutionary when it stopped being a tool for researchers and became available to everyone. The Flathead V8 changed America because it put real performance within reach of working people. And those working people, given access to power, built a culture around it. They created hot rods and drag racing and an entire aesthetic of speed that persists to this day. Walk into any car show in America and you will see Flathead-powered hot rods. Not because they are the fastest engines anymore, they are not even close, but because they represent something. They represent the idea that you can start with something simple and affordable, and through skill and dedication, create something extraordinary. The hot rod builders of the 40s and 50s were not wealthy. They were not professionally trained engineers. They were kids who loved cars and wanted to go fast. The Flathead gave them the means to pursue that passion. And in doing so, it created a uniquely American form of expression. There's something almost philosophical about the Flathead's design philosophy, too. Henry Ford believed in simplicity. He believed that if you could not make something simple enough for mass production, you had not thought about it hard enough. The Flathead embodied that belief. One-piece block casting, side valve design, minimal complexity. That simplicity had a cost in ultimate performance, but it had an enormous benefit in accessibility. More people could afford it, more people could understand it, more people could modify it. The trade-off was worth it. Modern engineering often prioritizes sophistication, variable valve timing, direct injection, turbocharging with electronic wastegate control. These technologies extract remarkable performance from small displacement engines, but they also make engines essentially impossible for average people to modify or even repair. The Flathead era was different. You could understand your engine. You could improve it with your own hands. There was a direct connection between the person and the machine that has largely been lost. Maybe that's why traditional hot rodding persists. Maybe that's why people still build Flathead-powered cars decades after the engine went out of production. It's not about having the fastest car. It's about having a car you truly understand and truly made your own. The cultural legacy of the Flathead V8 extends into places you might not expect. Rock and roll music. The Beach Boys sang about Little Deuce Coupes and 4-speed dual quad-posit traction, 411 gears. Car culture and youth culture became intertwined in the 1950s and 60s, and that intertwining started with affordable V8 power. The muscle car era of the late 60s and early 70s was a direct descendant of the hot rod movement. Factory engineers who had grown up building flathead hot rods were now designing HEMIS and big blocks for Detroit. The same philosophy applied. Make it accessible. Make it fast. Let the customer experience real power. Even today, the American automotive industry's emphasis on horsepower traces back to the Flathead. Europeans prioritize handling and efficiency. Americans want power. That preference was shaped in the dry lakes of California by kids with modified Ford engines. Well, there we are. A simple, affordable engine designed during the Great Depression accidentally created American hot rod culture, spawned the entire automotive aftermarket industry, and shaped our national relationship with the automobile. The Flathead V8 succeeded not by being the most sophisticated option, but by being the most accessible one. It proved that in engineering, as in life, sometimes simplicity beats complexity. Ford built an engine that regular people could afford and understand. Those regular people did extraordinary things with it. They raced across dry lake beds. They built machines that looked like rolling sculptures. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible with basic tools and abundant creativity. The expensive V12 engines of the era are now museum pieces. But the Flathead lives on in garages and at car shows across America. Because ultimately, the best technology is not the most advanced. It is the technology that puts power in the hands of the people. And that is the story of the Ford Flathead V8. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.